No? So, welcome everybody to this slightly unusual ethics seminar. My name is Olle Häggström. I'm professor of mathematical statistics at Chalmers. And our special guest today is Jaan Tallinn. Jaan studied theoretical physics at the University of Tartu and started his career as a games programmer. He went on to co-create Skype, and after that, he's been involved in various activities, but a large part has been philanthropy, including co-founding in 2012 the Centre for Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, and financial support for various groups working on AI safety. But let me just ask by asking you, Jaan, how are things going over in Estonia?
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, it's sort of crisis situation as in most of the world, if not the entire world. We had like a medium severity lockdown for the last couple of months, and the restrictions were mostly lifted yesterday. So now it kind of remains to be seen, like what the numbers will do as a result. But it's, I mean, myself, I'm kind of used to working from home anyway, so it's no big change for me other than basically no travel, which is a pretty big change because I usually travel about like 40% of my time.
Yeah. Personally, I find that cutting down on travel and retreating to one's home, it has upsides as well.
Yeah, sure. Like I get like much more regular exercise, for example, and I get like many sort of second priority projects done that otherwise I never would get to. So that's the sort of silver lining. But I kind of do miss travel and seeing face-to-face people who I kind of share interest with. There isn't like that big AI safety community in Estonia.
No, but we have Zoom and stuff like that.
Yeah, sure.
Skype, I guess. I understand that you became interested in AI risk and AI safety issues before this whole thing with the deep learning boom took off in the early 2010s. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how this happened?
Yeah, so my interest in AI safety was not predicated in any particular AI technique. It really was sort of sparked, I think in 2007 or 2008, when I stumbled upon the writings of Eliezer Yudkowsky, who was making like very strong case about the default outcome from the current AI trajectory, not kind of having a happy ending for humanity. And because that was a very novel thought for me in 2008 or 2007, I don't actually remember. I started kind of writing his essays in general and found them like super fascinating. So in early 2009, I just shot him an email having to be in California for a Skype business. And then we met up and we ended up like talking for 4 hours about these topics. And then I was like completely convinced that this is the most important yet underappreciated topic that we have.
Yes. Because at that point you were looking for something meaningful to do?
Yeah, a little bit, like because I had been with Skype since its start. We kind of started coding it in 2002. So like for almost, well, a little bit less than a decade, like 2 quarters or like 3 quarters of decade. And yeah, indeed. So like that was like one of the things that kind of finally gave me something new to do after Skype.
Yes. And you had some money to put into stuff that you found meaningful and interesting?
Indeed. So like there is this technical term known in startup culture is called "fuck you money."
Yeah.
So like there's like if you kind of cross certain threshold, like you don't have to do anything. Now the problem with like not having to do anything is that like now you have to think for yourself and figure out what actually kind of is a fulfilling thing for you to do. And let me tell you, it is not trivial. So like one thing that Estonian founding engineers of Skype, there are 4 of us, have done is kind of there are 4 things that I can think of that somebody who basically has enough money to kind of last through the retirement could do, and the 4 engineers here have done like 4 all of those. So yeah, myself basically I became a philanthropist. Then another one became a serial entrepreneur, and third one basically became a professional investor, and the 4th one retired. So yeah, myself I've been kind of splitting my time between investing and philanthropy, and like as time goes by, I've been kind of focusing more and more on philanthropy, and in particular sort of AI safety and other existential risks.
But if you consider philanthropy important, maybe it makes sense to still spend some money and effort on investing, so you can do more philanthropy.
Yeah. So what I've been sort of doing is kind of delegating away my investing. So a couple of 3 years ago, I hired someone full time to actually kind of do the stuff that you do the admin work and the initial calls with companies, etc. And that's because like as my portfolio has grown, it became like a very serious burden on my time. And now I've been kind of institutionalizing my investment side. So I've been kind of most of my actual effort can go to philanthropy and other things.
So going back to this meeting with Elsie Yudkowsky in 2009, you mentioned this in your chapter in the book that came out last year, a collection edited by John Brockman called, what's it called? Possible Minds,
25 possible minds,
yeah. Different ways of looking at AI and some very prominent contributors. And your chapter here is called Dissident Messages.
Indeed.
It's a I think it's a very interesting book. Of course, as always, with collections between different authors, the level of interest varies somewhat, but I very much like your chapter. And you make a very illuminating parallel there between the AI safety issue and experience from the Soviet Union, which I mean, it becomes a little personal for you because you grew up in the Soviet Union. Do you want to explain this parallel?
Yeah, I see. I mean, there are obviously like many influences that I kind of date back to my upbringing in behind the Iron Curtain. But like one particular parallel that I have seen, both saw in Soviet Union when it was kind of starting to crumble, and during the last decade where I kind of started in AI safety community, which was really tiny and like almost nobody was taking seriously, although like they were clearly saying a true thing, and like it's very easy to show that they were saying a true thing by just like kind of looking like what had people before them said about including kind of luminaries like Turing or Norbert Wiener. But there was like this like social stigma that I think the AI community itself had kind of created so like let's not talk. It's like it's not considered kind of kosher to talk about a few things. It's not kosher to talk about consciousness, and it's not kosher to talk about sort of AI reaching human level in terms of its kind of capabilities. And like obviously in Soviet Union there were like many things that were not kosher to talk about, and so I guess you can kind of generalize that into like what are the sort of incentives for people to spread certain ideas. And in Soviet Union, the incentives were very clear. Like if you said certain things, KGB will disappear you. So if there were like very stark incentives. Whereas in academia, you have like that bunch of other incentives that kind of discourage you from kind of straying too far from the official position as defined by your peer group. So they're wanting, indeed, like what I saw in Soviet Union was once those incentive mechanisms started to crumble and people had kind of demonstrations outside and voila, they were not disappeared. So and then basically those memes that were kind of most people knew that were true, but like nobody dared to talk about. They suddenly, people kind of woke up and that flipping from like nobody talking about them in kind of fear of retribution to almost everybody talking about them was like in less than a year. So and I saw that similar thing in AI safety community where kind of or sorry AI community where people like almost nobody talking about the potential downsides of AI. To I think the survey was in 2016, where kind of the most prominent as defined by people who were published at the top AI conferences, like 40% of them thought that kind of, a long-term future or like potential, thinking about the potential long-term future with AI is important or the most important problem of the field.
Have you seen Cass Sunstein's work? He has his most recent book is on conformity and how ideas can be held by many people, but nobody talks about them, and then it depends on the distribution of what thresholds people have. So some people are very outspoken and don't need many peers to openly share their view to dare to speak out, and others have different thresholds, and this can cascade very quickly, which I believe, I mean, things happened quite fast in the Soviet Union towards the end. In this
the crumbling went like really quickly. Yeah, I think there are sort of like societal attractors when it comes to certain kind of topics or certain positions that you can have, and like as the kind of some attractors loosen, the other ones kind of strengthen, and so you might have like really quick kind of phase transition, so to speak, between sort of mainstream opinions.
A rapid movement of the Overton window.
Yeah.
So when you talk about these long-term issues, what are the main concerns? What are the scenarios you have in mind, and so on?
Yeah, so I mean, I look at kind of existential risk in general, not just risk from AI, and sort of my top three risks that I kind of currently assign the most probability to are kind of risk from AI, like, and here like kind of okay, let me come back to that. The second is sort of risks from biology and synthetic biology especially, and the third one is basically unknown unknowns. So unknown unknowns basically kind of acknowledges the fact that the other two things in top three are basically things that we didn't even think about 100 years ago. So it's very plausible that if you look ahead 100 years or more, we might get some new surprises about what are the things that might be kind of dangerous to the entire civilization. Biology, synthetic biology is an interesting thing because it like evolution is constrained in many ways. Like it cannot build like things that like, I mean, I give examples that it cannot. Evolution never built radios, for example. It never built firearms. It never built space travel. Clearly, things that humans have built, and there are like very good reasons why evolution is kind of evolutionary design has like a lot of difficulty reaching certain points in design space where there's like a less fit points in between. So it has difficulty kind of jumping over obstacles in design space. And the other thing is kind of like looking at sort of motivation at the risk of anthropomorphizing evolution. Like evolution just doesn't have motivation to do certain things. For example, there is no motivation for evolution to build kind of pathogens that would be kind of that would have maximally devastating effect. Like it's just interested in making replicas.
If a pathogen is kills its victims too much, then I guess that's suicidal behavior.
Exactly. So like there's like pathogens usually like there's this trend that they tend to evolve towards being kind of more benign towards their host because that helps with their replication. But like humans are not constrained by such kind of evolutionary constraints when they do their design. So like it's certainly there's a concern that synthetic biology might kind of produce organisms that are just much more lethal and much more problematic than anything that evolution ever would produce. So yeah, and then like AI, a friend of mine, Andrew Critchin at Berkeley University, has this wonderful paper in the works where he kind of defines sort of minimum AI that can be dangerous. And that AI, he calls it prepotent AI, and it has two requirements. First requirement is that it's an AI that would have as big impact on the environment than humans have had. So it is at least as capable, effective environment than human civilization has had. And the second requirement is it is an AI that humans no longer can stop. And it doesn't like say anything why we can't stop it. Perhaps you can't stop it because it's like too clever to kind of be under our control.
So when you say dangerous here, you mean dangerous on the level of existential risk?
Yes. So yeah. So and the other reason why we might not be able to stop it is just like systemic reasons. Like for example, I think it's very hard to stop internet at this point. I think it's still possible, by the way, but I think it's not trivial, and it's getting harder by the year. So there might be similar reasons that we have like this like game theoretic or systemic reasons why we no longer can stop an AI that has at least as big impact on the environment than humans have. So and once you have something, as we see from global warming, we're already kind of concerned, and some people we no longer can rule out that human impact on the environment would kind of destroy human species as it has destroyed many other species already. I mean, it's unlikely, but we don't have guarantees about runaway climate change. But I think it's way worse with prepotent AI for a few reasons. Like one is that like if you define something that is potentially smarter than humans, for it to change the environment, for it would be easier to change the environment than for humans. And the second thing is that AI just doesn't, by default, it doesn't care about the environment as much as humans do. We are biological species, therefore, like we're very tuned for a very narrow range of environmental parameters when you look at from just cosmic perspective. That's why we think that that's why we see that most of the planets are not inhabitable for humans, whereas they clearly are inhabitable for robots. So because like robots have like much more relaxed kind of operating range when it comes to environmental parameters. So that's why I think like prepotent AI could be obviously existential risk.
But if they don't care about the environment, why then would they change the environment?
Because yeah, so like one thing is that like whatever you do, you will have kind of side effects. In like, for example, humans do not care specifically about the placement of air molecules. So like whatever we do, we just don't think about the concrete placement of air molecules in Earth atmosphere or in the rooms. So like it's like if there was like some kind of species or some kind of agent that really, really cares about some particular placement of air molecules, we're going to be just completely devastating to that species. And similarly, like if we have let an AI loose, whose goal is to do something that we even might be interested in, might even consider valuable, but if it just doesn't care about the environment, like we don't care about the placement of air molecules, then they might just have like very outsized effect on the environment. The second reason is that is like when I say that AI doesn't care about the environment, that was like a first approximation. It obviously cares about the environment to some degree. So it's like, for example, it's if you are an AI that is about to build its own civilization scale projects, it's very plausible to me as an engineer that it would have easier time doing that in vacuum. So like it might be kind of a good strategy for it to kind of first dump the Earth's atmosphere and then start those projects, because like, yeah, it would be just useful for those projects, for the success of those projects.
So you could say that the problem is not that the AI doesn't care about the environment, but rather that it doesn't value precisely those properties that we value as biological entities.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, yeah, it has a kind of much more relaxed constraints about the environment, and yeah, so like it is kind of our job to make sure that that it would have those constraints that we kind of we care about as species, including about the environment.
This type of scenario we're talking about now comes across as very extreme. And if you compare this to other topics that we've brought up earlier this year at this AI ethics seminar, we talked about, for instance, fairness and discrimination in AI algorithms, making decisions that affect people. We've also talked about the effect of automation on the labor market and economic inequality and so on. These are much more down-to-earth things. There seems to be a disconnect here between.
Yeah, so the one way of putting it is that like those things that people are discussing about right now, like sort of fairness of automated decisions in like kind of I don't know, court cases, for example, like they sound like down to earth now, but if you go back 20 years, they would have been complete science fiction. So like it's kind of necessary that if you are thinking about like 20 or more years ahead, the topics that you are thinking about, they do sound very likely science fiction to people who don't think ahead. So it's kind of, it's a unfortunate side effect that when you're talking about things that people don't have experience with, then you are kind of automatically at a sort of disadvantage when it comes to discourse, because you have to kind of establish kind of logically how those things, even if they don't feel intuitively important, might become important even intuitively so, like in just a few years, a few decades.
So what if I play the devil's advocate here and suggest that we know so little about these several decades ahead scenarios that it's useless to think about them?
So one important consideration is that if we can already see that we will have a problem and we don't have a solution at hand, then we should have at least an idea how long it would take us to solve that problem. And if we cannot have a kind of very clear idea how we would go about solving that problem, then we kind of shouldn't automatically stop from solving that problem. Then we should go into thinking about what are the productive things that we can already do in preparation for this later time. In other ways, like if you know that you have a deadline, it's not responsible to kind of say that, well, this deadline is going to be in the future, therefore, like, I'm not going to do anything about it. Like, you really need to think about like how much work you need to do between now and the deadline, and then try to figure out how to kind of spread out that time, spread out that work. So, and it's clear, like, from several AI safety research agendas that there already are a bunch of research work that can be done even now before we have anything resembling kind of superhuman intelligence.
Do you have any favorite examples of that?
Yeah, so I think my favorite example to give as first example is transparency, because like I mean, it's not a great example when it comes to just long term. It's the only kind of thing that that there is overlap between short term AI safety research and long term AI safety research. There is the overlap of transparency. So I think like everything that we kind of the research that we can do in order to make our systems more transparent, this will also pay off in the long term. However, like I think your question was about research that is not beneficial now, but will be beneficial in the long term. So yeah, there are many examples of that. Like one very interesting example that I think MIRI, Machine Intelligence Research Institute, is particularly interested in is a topic called embedded agency. The idea is that the AI field so far has worked with the assumption that AI is like a dualist in the sense that there's very clear boundary between the AI system and the rest of the environment. So the AI systems that we build now, like none of them have this concept that they are part of the environment. So any action they perform on the environment will actually also come back to it and modify it either directly or indirectly. And we don't actually have good theories. Like the entire AI field is kind of predicated on this simplifying assumption that there's a clear delineation between the agent and the environment. And we know that this assumption is not true. Like humans don't have that assumption when we work. Like when I set ablaze my apartment, like I expect to be dying as a result. Like AIs don't do that. AIs don't have that assumption. Now the question is like, yeah, how much we know that we will have to relax that assumption at some point, and we like as long as the AIs aren't kind of like as long as the AIs aren't super capable, we can sort of overlook that assumption, but they clearly is a productive work already being done. Like, what does it mean to relax that assumption? And MIRI, for example, in their Agent Foundations program is doing that work.
MIRI is the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, which was started by Alexei Yukovsky, whom you mentioned at the beginning, right?
Yes.
Okay, but so you mentioned these three main existential risks: AI and synthetic biology, and then the third category was unknown unknowns, or however you phrased it. Wouldn't you at least agree that it's difficult to make progress in the unknown unknown category?
Interestingly, people have already made progress
Yes?
in the unknown unknown category to some degree. For example, there was like a wonderful paper by I think Max Tegmark and some other people from Future of Humanity Institute, I think, where they kind of analyze the dangers that human species can face from various things like kind of changes of laws of physics, etc. By just looking at using kind of anthropic principle. Now, anthropic principle is just a very simple principle that when you look around, you should expect the environment that you see be compatible with your existence. So like if you look around, you shouldn't expect that there be like vacuum or like 1,000 degrees Celsius or something like that, or like complete like 0 Kelvin or something. And like one thing that we see when we look around is that we see like fairly, well, we see a fairly young universe, but it could be much younger. If the universe was like super dangerous, we should expect it to see a like very young universe when we look out. If there were kind of dangers facing us like every year. So like if there's like if there's a danger like 50% chance of getting killed every year, the chances of surviving like 4 billion on this planet alone are just like completely infinitesimal, right? So like there you can kind of obtain some guarantees about those unknowns as well, in a very interesting philosophical way.
Oh, interesting. So let me just now remind the audience that you have the possibility to ask questions via chat. So I'll check in on that in a few minutes. But until then, let's go back to this issue of biological risk, which connects to the current COVID-19 crisis. Do you think that there is stuff to be learned from the present crisis that is sufficiently generalizable to be applicable to AI risk and other kinds of existential risk? I mean, it seems clear that COVID-19 does not pose existential risk to us. It's a much milder thing.
Yeah, I've been kind of calling COVID crisis a little bit jokingly, perhaps inappropriately, like a minimum viable global catastrophe. In startup community, you have this concept of minimum viable product, which means that like you're not supposed to like put a lot of effort into integrating something that will get you market feedback. You should create something that is relevant enough or representative enough, and then release it in order to get feedback from the market. And I think like COVID crisis is kind of, in some important aspects, kind of representative enough of like other global catastrophes that we even already have had, like world wars, for example, while being much more benign. So it's, in that sense, I think it's, kind of, in theoretical sense, it's very valuable to have this kind of species-wide problem in the living memory of people, because like there aren't that many people left who kind of still remember World War II. So it's, I think it's valuable for kind of leaders and like populations in general to know that like these things happen. And it's not just kind of politicians against other politicians. It's also sometimes like it's humans as species against the nature, or against like something that is kind of external to the entire species. So in that sense, I think it's kind of very valuable lesson. It's kind of very hard to see right now how well it generalizes. I think it's possible that most of the crisis is still ahead of us, and it's not. Yeah, I think it's too early to tell exactly like how it would be helpful, but I'm hoping it's definitely that we can learn some lessons.
My concern is that the lessons we pick up collectively as a society, it would be bad if they are too narrow. If the lesson is that we need to get better at handling pandemics with an R0 close to 2.5 and a death rate of 0.7%.
Yeah, I mean that I mean, it can be even narrower. It can be like, don't trust people in Wuhan, right? Wuhan labs, right? That's even more like kind of like in general. I think that there's one fork in the road that we seem to be facing, and I really hope that we're going down like the right path, because the wrong path would be just like kind of as an aftermath of this crisis, there'd be like some kind of mudslinging and going like, no, it was China, it was like, no, it was like some inadequate politicians, etc. Clearly, like there's a lot of blame to be distributed, but I think it's much more productive for the future of species to treat it as a learning experience and actually kind of give positive, like raise positive examples, and hope that they will kind of stick around.
So one of these down-to-earth topics, near-term AI risks that people talk about is AI-enabled mass surveillance, because that's really something that requires AI or similarly powerful technology, because we don't have the manpower to totally surveil an entire population. Even East Germany wasn't able to do that efficiently. Do you think, I mean, the COVID crisis, with all the suggestions about disease tracking and so on, shows maybe some advantages that we haven't really realized before with mass surveillance. Do you think that this will permanently change the way we think about mass surveillance, and maybe we're at the risk of entering some China-like social credit system or something?
Yeah, I don't know how exactly, like, again, it's possible that most of the crisis is still ahead of us, and especially like the time where we have to be kind of more vigilant while opening up the societies. I think there's like a clear trade-off between security and privacy, but like it's not like one-dimensional trade-off. Like more security automatically means like less privacy or vice versa. But like one way of looking at it is that I think privacy is like you can think of it as like a currency that you have to, like, rather, yeah, you can think of privacy as a currency, just like income people have. And one way that people one way that countries operate is that they kind of take a portion of the income from people and then like apply that to kind of projects of common good. At least that's what they're supposed to do. Now, you always have these issues like, are they doing the right job when they're doing this collection and kind of application to common good projects? And I think you can ask the same thing, like if the governments would sort of confiscate a portion of the privacy from people, then that's clearly a cost that people pay. And now the question is like, are they going to apply that towards common good, and are they kind of competent enough? So I think it's in some ways like a similar trade-off question.
Oh, yes. I guess the problem until now, part of the problem until now, is that while I see very clearly when I have a cost of $1,000 for something, it's not as visible to me when some of my privacy is lost in order to access some convenient app or something. I've lost your sound, Jaan. Do you hear me? Why is your microphone on? I'm turning it on here, I hope.
Yep. Looks like the settings are like, if I mute myself, then I cannot unmute it myself.
I see. Okay. So where were we?
Yeah, so we were about, yeah, I think you're making a right point that the problem with the analogy to taxes basically is that if governments tax people, then this is something that people will understand, will basically feel. If they take away your privacy or like reduce your privacy, this is like harder to monitor. However, sort of the flip side of this kind of suggests an obvious intervention, which is like kind of making the privacy reductions more visible. So like, as far as I know, I'm not an expert here. I think like the Estonian e-health system works in a way that that there is doctors, if needed, they can kind of look up everyone's records. However, the act of actually looking at the record will leave like auditable trail. So the idea is that exactly that you in some ways you kind of potentially give away your privacy to the medical system. However, you will get feedback if there will be like a use or abuse of that potential. So that's an obvious intervention to do, make it more visible.
We have a question here from the audience. It's from Björn Bengtsson, who's a friend of mine and a secondary school teacher. And he asks, he's obviously thinking about his students here. He asks what advice you have for young people who want to make as great a positive impact as possible.
So my usual answer in that case is go to the site 80,000 hours. I'll just post it to the chat as well. It's basically one of the organizations in the kind of existential risk community that is specifically focused on career advice, and they have like excellent podcast and many materials on their site that are specifically addressed towards young people who want to maximize their career, maximize the good from their career, which is expected to, in expectation, last for 80,000 hours. So think about like what you're going to do with your 80,000 hours.
I love that podcast. They often go on for like 2.5 hours or something and go really deep into the topics. We should mention that they're not limited to existential risk concerns.
That they're part of the so-called effective altruism movement. So like, and there are kind of two main schools of thought in effective altruism. One is where we can call it long-termism, where you do think about what are the things that we are not prepared for and how can we kind of move the needle there. And the other is just like looking at what are the good things that you can do now in a fairly verifiable manner. So like and then they use various interventions in order to kind of get assurances about this donations working, etc.
Another question here from the audience from Gordana Dudikson-Kovic, who serves together with me on the Chalmers AI Ethics Committee. She asks about what should AI ethics be saying about these long-term risks? What is the ethics of extreme AI risk?
So I mean, one very, there are at least two things that come to mind immediately. One is the population ethics in general, and there are many kind of unsolved problems there, like how much do you value lives that are not born yet, lives that have, but how much do you value future lives, even though they don't exist? And there is like this discussion in AI community of saying that it's a matter of like, as just like we concern, it's basically like what should be your circle of moral concern. So if we are now, as we kind of make moral progress, showing concern about so-called disenfranchised parts of population, like we can make the case that future generations are like ultimately disenfranchised because they have like no voice in present matters, whereas like those present matters very much influence their kind of well-being. So like your population ethics, solving various problems there is probably going to be super important, super productive. And the other thing is sort of meta, thinking about like, okay, what if we don't solve all these problems? How can we deal with this moral uncertainty? So like the kind of moral uncertainty and ways to hedge our bets would also be very useful when it comes to kind of long-term issues. And then we have like a bunch of specific things, like for example, I mean, we have discussed quite a bit about this machine consciousness, and I do think that it's I mean, first of all, people do make this mistake quite often, that they're going to confuse competence and consciousness. And I think this is like a just mistake. Like I think it's very likely that we could have like unconscious, super competent machines, at which point basically we have, which means that they would be in certain framework that is different from humans who are conscious, or we might, we cannot rule out also conscious machines, at which point they should be kind of part of the moral concerns. So I think it's kind of there is again like a chance for some nuanced thinking for ethicists there.
I have this intuition that a necessary requirement for us to have moral obligations towards robots is that the robots are conscious. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's like a long and interesting discussion that we could be having about this, but it's probably don't have time to that. But yeah, I think that consciousness seems to be like a very important. And the interesting question is like, are there also cases where we should have like moral concerns about unconscious parts of the space-time, and it's I think this is an interesting discussion to be had there. But like clearly, like if there's a conscious being, be it like human or animal or synthetic agent, we should be very careful when we do like experiments on it or etc.
So one more thing connecting the COVID crisis to AI safety. But there's this quite widespread idea in this X-risk community that there's a race going on between, on one hand, technological development, and on the other hand, human wisdom. And people are worried that the technology is developing so fast that we don't have time to figure out how to do wise things with it. Do you have any intuition for how something like the COVID crisis might affect this race?
So I'm not sure, but I'm certainly hoping that there, again, the same thing that I answered before, that the fact that we have something in our living memory as a civilization, like a species-wide problem, we can kind of lean on it when we try to intuit other problems in that class, potentially bigger problems, and therefore we might be kind of be able to constrain our activities as a civilization.
So the crisis could somehow help us to grow a little bit wiser than we otherwise.
Indeed, yeah, that's.
But if you look at the other competitor here, technological development, my intuition is that AI development is probably not at all hampered by the present crisis, because people can do just like you and me and sit home and continue with
Yeah. I don't actually know how much this is hampered, because like, I mean, there is no reason why it should be hampered in principle. However, there might be some kind of practical reasons, for example, like, I don't know, operational security for code bases or something like that, which like ideally would be there. Usually it isn't, but yeah, so that is kind of sort of operational question, like how much this is hampering the crisis, is hampering kind of technological development in general.
Something that people have started talking a little bit about, at least in my circuits, is what will the present crisis do to the institution of the university? And Cedric Sagitov, my mathematics colleague at Chalmers, he asked precisely this in the chat. What is your vision of the future of the university?
Yeah,
if you don't have one, you can just pass.
Yeah, I don't think this isn't the topic that I kind of think too much about. There certainly are people whose kind of opinions I respect, who are kind of super cynical about the education system in general.
Robin Hanson, maybe?
Yeah, exactly, Robin Hanson. And who forget the guy who wrote the book against
Brian Kaplan?
Brian Kaplan, Case Against the Great. Yep. I do think that there's kind of they do have a point,
Yeah.
like perhaps like a too extreme one, but I do think that there is a. I mean, especially in the U.S., from what I hear, that their educational system is just completely out of control when it comes to dominating the fraction of expenses that society has. So it's they're clearly not like 100 times better than they used to be like 100 years ago, but they're, from what I understand, like 10 to 100 times more expensive.
So one concern that is sometimes lifted by people who I think typically have not read Jaan Kaplan is that we're now doing all the teaching and so on remotely, and both teachers and students discover that this is possible, and that this will be the beginning of the end of the physical university campus. And then things will be lost. Values that we're not thinking too clearly about. That,
yeah, that's also, that is also, I mean, there is, I think, yeah, I can kind of recommend Robin Hansen's book, Elephant in the Brain.
Yeah.
I think like the most general lesson from that book is that like, if you look around, the social institutions and structures really aren't what they are, what they seem to be in the first place, what the naive story of society tells them. Like medical system is to improve your health. Well, sometimes, but it's also like just some institution to give a lot of people employment, and like sometimes those goals are in conflict, for example, or in tension, etc.
That's a wonderful book, The Elephant in the Brain, co-authored by Kevin Simler and Robin Hansen. Can we talk a little bit about geopolitics?
Sure.
The geopolitics around AI seems to revolve mostly just around the United States and China. Do you think that Europe is relevant at all?
Well, it's definitely relevant in some aspects. Like
it's relevant to us because we're Europeans.
Yeah. DeepMind is in Europe, for example. It's the leading AI lab in the world, I would say. Although it's not. I mean, it's part of a US company now. I do think that there are kind of some initiatives from Europe, like GDPR, like you can kind of diminish and criticize GDPR. On the other hand, like it is like a bold thing to do, and I do think that the world is, at least, I think the world in general is better off when it comes to like just having this thing as an example, at least. So like I do think that Europe has, GDPR is like a European contribution. It's kind of certainly setting an example. You can argue is a good or bad example, but it's a different one. So I do think that Europe might contribute more when it comes to.
Europe is still big enough and powerful enough that something like GDPR matters to Google.
Yeah, I think EU is still like one of the largest, if not the largest market in terms of purchasing power. Is it? I'm not sure actually, but it's like one of the top three, right?
Yeah.
At the very least.
Yes. You're on this committee serving under the EU Commission, the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence. Best known for the what's it called? The trustworthy AI document that came out last year, which Stuart Russell described as the most influential AI ethics policy so far. What's your experience from this work?
Yeah, I think like I saw like similar trends there that I kind of already described, that there is like still like this social transition hasn't completely happened when it comes to thinking about the long-term concerns. So I do think that while the ethics guidelines, and now we're in the process of turning those into like a assessment list of different questions so companies and various institutions can go and try to have like a framework of questions and checklists that they kind of ideas that they might, or of concerns that they might not even think about by default. So I do think that the work of that expert group is producing value when it comes to sort of dealing with the concerns that we already have about AI. Now, my sort of, again, a little bit whimsical way of describing this that I sometimes do is that it's a great AI ethics guidelines for the AI we had 5 years ago. So it's so yeah, which is positive. Like it's better to have that than not. But yeah, it was me and a couple of other people there, and you also helped a little bit as a commentator that tried to kind of put like more emphasis on the longer term concerns, but that didn't work out. So interesting. As the guidelines, they have like evolved a little bit. There are some things that we have included that are not kind of specifically targeted about long-term concerns, but they are general enough to kind of encompass a little bit of them. For example, there is this question in the latest revision. We'll see if it remains there. That have you thought about ways how your AI system might learn to accomplish goals that might actually be kind of detrimental for human safety? So this is like a question that is kind of reasonable to ask for reinforcement learners in general, be they kind of short-term or long-term.
Yeah, I think it's very valuable when you construct questionnaires like that, self-evaluations, that you help people think more broadly and more outside the box than they might otherwise have.
Yeah, in general, I do think that there is value in highlighting sort of hidden assumptions that you have as a technology developer. I mean, one obvious one is that like if something goes bad, it's not my fault. Like this assumption is like a very dangerous thing to have.
Yes. We're getting close to the full hour here, and we shouldn't. We don't want to take more of your time and audience's time. But I have this one question that I'd like to pose as a challenge to you, namely, so you do all these good things, speaking for AI safety issues and investing in good research environments, working on this and so on. If you could clone yourself, and if you could also clone your financial assets, so that we would have 2 Jaan Tallinns in the world, what would you have the other Jaan Tallinn do that you currently don't have time for?
Sorry, what's the constraint that I would not do AI or existential risk?
No constraint. Just what if you could double your capacity? What would there be anything that you don't do now that you would expand into?
Yeah, I think I would still like. There's like a way more things to be working on when it comes to AI safety and existential risks in particular, because although like the community and the resources there are like growing exponentially right now, which is great, they're still starting from a very small base. So right now, I don't think I have like very interesting answer to that. Just do more of the stuff that I.
Do you think that we're not at a point where there's a shortage of talent here? I mean, you don't want to pour money into something that just attracts.
Yeah. I do think that there is a shortage of talent. Yeah, like yeah, I do think that talent is a bigger bottleneck right now than money is. Like Open Philanthropy project started by Facebook founder Dustin Moskovich. Like they right now are spending tens of millions per year for specific long-term concerns, including AI safety, and they kind of keep growing. So like sort of financial constraints are kind of easing up pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we should stop here. Thank you very much for this interesting discussion. And I say thank you to the audience as well. I see that there are still some 50 people sitting around listening to us. Thank you for your patience. To me, this was very interesting. Thank you, Jaan, and talk to you later.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.